Welcome, settle in. Let the world around you begin to fade. The light from your screen, dim. The day's worries, softening. You've arrived at a quieter place now. Not the gleaming marble, not the roar of the Colosseum, nor the triumphs of emperors. To be forgotten, thoroughly and officially, as if you had never existed at all. No, tonight, we move softly through the darker corridors. The unseen punishments, the quiet erasures, the names that once held power, now dust in forgotten inscriptions. If you'd like to share, softly, in the comments, a place where the past flows slowly, like a river through ancient stone. Tonight, we drift back into the heart of an empire, but not the Rome you often hear about. The slow scraping of a name from a stone, the chisel tapping gently, steadily, over a statue's face, a gouge smooth and clean, an image removed, a name left unfinished in public records, a gap, a silence, a forgotten soul by deliberate design. Because Rome, for all its glory, was also a machine of control. And sometimes, the worst fate was not pain or death, but silence. Not out of urgency, but simply so you can return. Whenever your mind seeks quiet company and your body seeks rest. The Romans called it Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Let your mind imagine. If you find comfort in these slower journeys through the past, I gently invite you to subscribe. And while we settle in, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? It's always a quiet wonder, seeing how far these slow stories travel, from one quiet room to another, across oceans and night skies. And so, we begin. Origins and ideology of Damnatio Memoriae. Imagine yourself in the heart of ancient Rome, perhaps on a quiet evening, just after the Forum begins to empty. The sky a dusky gold, an empty pedestal. The absence is almost louder than the presence. The idea of memory as power was already deeply woven into the Roman worldview. To the Romans, fama, reputation, legacy was nearly as important as life itself. To be remembered meant to continue. To be praised in stone or poetry meant, in some way, to remain alive. The marble glows faintly in the last rays of sun. You pass monuments and statues, inscriptions etched into stone, names proudly carved. Not a dramatic trial. Though not formally condemned, after his death, much of his legacy was quietly dismantled. But it was under the emperors that this practice became formal. When he died or disappeared in 68 CE, the Senate declared him a public enemy. His images were pulled down. The Senate, which had grown weary under his autocracy, issued a sweeping damnatio. Statues of Domitian were smashed. Inscriptions altered. His titles revoked posthumously. His name removed from official documents. It wasn't quite unanimous. Some in the East still worshipped him. But in Rome, his presence became a silence, and quietly chilling. No shouting. You see, while memory could be condemned, traces often lingered. Even today, in subtle ways, the erasure of memory occurs, not through chisels, but with omission, with silence, with the forgetting of names that once stirred fear or pride. A statue refashioned to resemble someone else still bore the shape of the original. Coins already minted sometimes slipped through, and people remembered. Just scrolls, through law, through architecture. It was not loud. It was not bloody. It was quiet, intentional, like a whisper removed from a conversation, changing its meaning entirely. Records altered, decrees sent out. The man in question already dead, his name now declared unworthy of remembrance, his honors revoked, statues removed or repurposed, coins melted. In the official ledgers of Rome, he begins to vanish. Deeds immortalized. We will step softly through ruined statues, marred inscriptions, and histories that skip a name, as if the wind had turned a page too quickly. But in the corner of your eye, Something doesn't quite match. A statue without a face. A name crudely scratched out. This is where our story begins. Long before the term Damnatio Memoriae was coined by modern historians. Thus, to erase someone from memory was to kill them a second time. It wasn't just about vengeance. It was order, control, a societal editing tool. The state could not always undo what had been done, but it could attempt to make it unhappen. Like water smoothed over the sand, wiping away footprints. The earliest precedents come from the Republic. Roman consuls and senators occasionally removed images or dedications of dishonored figures. But it wasn't until the empire emerged, when a single man could rule everything, that the concept grew teeth. Imagine the Senate gathered in quiet condemnation. Among the earliest notable victims was Publius Clodius Pulcher, a firebrand tribune whose political gains unnerved both enemies and allies. Take the case of Emperor Nero. And then there was Domitian, the stern, controlling emperor, assassinated in 96 CE. The process was never perfect. Still, the intention was clear, to make an individual unhappen. This wasn't about punishing the dead. It was about warning the living. As you rest deeper into this tale, picture how this form of punishment wrapped itself around society. It crept through art. The ideology behind it was both ancient and modern. Rome was simply more deliberate about it. And so, in this first layer of our descent, we see not a violent punishment, but a gentle, deliberate unmaking. You might be wondering, who exactly were these erased men? What did they do to deserve it? How did the city itself react? That is where we go next. When you are ready, we will gently explore the lives of those men, once powerful, now shadows. Let the silence of their memory guide us there. Emperors and elites wiped from history imagine. Now, walking through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, the heart of imperial Rome, the air is still. The soft murmur of distant footsteps, perhaps a bird echoing from the collapsed vaults of forgotten chambers. Amid crumbling stone and worn mosaics, there are still traces of grandeur, but there are also absences, empty plinths, repaired inscriptions, busts with suspiciously smooth features. These are not accidents of time. They are intentional. They are the remnants of Damnatio Memoriae in action. Let us now gently look closer at those who were erased. Not just nameless citizens, but emperors themselves. Some of Domitian's likenesses survived, often because artisans simply recarved the statue into someone else. But beneath the new features, the outlines of his face sometimes linger, softly, silently, waiting to be noticed. After the death of their father, Geta and his older brother Caracalla were meant to rule together. But the harmony of shared power was a fragile illusion. His rise from humble origins, a Thracian soldier of great size and strength, threatened the delicate balance of aristocratic rule. When the Senate turned against him, they declared him and his son enemies of the state. After his death, their images were torn down, their names scratched away, their brief grasp at power gone almost entirely. His reign was marked by religious upheaval, unconventional behaviors, and the alienation of Rome's elite. And these scars, in a way, became their own kind of memory. Damnatio Memoriae, then, was not justice in the moment, but posthumous correction. A second death. A purging from public identity, not as punishment for the condemned, but as a reassurance for the living. A message, quietly sent. This man no longer belongs to us. After his assassination at just 18, his body was discarded in the Tiber, and his name invoked only as a cautionary tale. We are not here to judge, nor to mourn, only to observe, to notice the quiet. Within a year, Caracalla had Geta murdered in their mother's arms, according to some. His memory allowed to rot in silence. Though never officially condemned like Geta or Domitian, Elagabalus became a ghost of reputation, mentioned in whispers, often falsely, often cruelly. always as a warning. These were not chaotic reactions, not mobs pulling down statues in fury. No, this was often slow, deliberate, legal, recorded by decree. The Senate would meet, to the stonecutter's bench, to the scribe's scroll, to the soldier ordered to strike down a statue's face, not in anger, but in duty. A vote would be taken. A name would be removed from the rolls of emperors. A title rescinded. A legacy unknotted. Men who once ruled the known world, made to vanish almost without a trace. One of the earliest and perhaps most famous examples is Emperor Geta, the younger son of Septimius Severus. Caracalla ordered Geta's name erased from every monument, every public document, carefully scraping names from parchment. Whispers continued in quiet corners. Children asked who the statue used to be. Rumors of the erased fed poetry, satire, and the darker corners of memory. Laborers hauling down busts, their movements quiet and routine. Stonecutters gently recarving inscriptions. The city changing not overnight, but steadily, so that one day the common man would pass a statue and no longer know whose face it once bore. Over 20,000 people were reportedly executed for mourning or supporting him, a grim hush falling over the empire. What followed was one of the most thorough memory condemnations in Roman history. Even the grand equestrian statue of him in the Forum was taken down. The base reused. His likeness erased. Look closer, and you will see the figure on the left has been chiseled away, the balance broken. That is Geta, or was. Walk through the museums of Rome today, and you may find a relief sculpture of two brothers, once side by side. He ruled for 15 years, not a short reign, and was known for his authoritarian control, strict discipline, and secretive paranoia. His death came not by illness or old age, but by conspiracy. Court insiders, perhaps even his own wife, were involved. Another tragic case is Domitian, the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty. Once dead, the Senate quickly moved to condemn his memory. His name was scratched from inscriptions. His statues were defaced or rededicated. But Rome is a city of layers, and total erasure was rare. Another emperor, Elagabalus, faced posthumous disgrace not through formal damnatio, but through sheer scandal. His portraits were smashed. And then there is Maximinus Thrax, the first of the so-called barracks emperors. What is remarkable in all these stories is not just the erasure, but the intent behind it. Imagine it, scribes working late by lamplight, but of course, people remembered. And so, the damnation was never perfect. The erasures were meant to cleanse, but they also left scars, faint outlines of what had been. You may notice a pattern here. Those who were condemned were often already dead. And so we float gently through this corridor of shadows, names undone, statues unmade, to see the shape of what is no longer there. And yet, one might wonder, how exactly did Rome carry out such wide, effective erasures? How were identities systematically unraveled across such a vast empire? That is what we'll explore next. Let your thoughts drift now, and when you're ready, we'll move on into the mechanics of forgetting. How names, images, and honors were removed. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and imagine not a scene of chaos or destruction, but a quiet courtyard at dawn, not to destroy, but to erase. The erasure of a man's memory was not a moment of violence. It was a method. It was slow, and it was thorough. The kind found in the heart of Roman cities, where stone columns cast long shadows, and dust settles in the corners. A single artisan stands on a wooden scaffold, his chisel poised against a marble statue. The birds have not yet stirred. These were perhaps the most methodically handled. Edits made. Their titles, consul, tribune, emperor, stripped from all official documentation. Their children's names altered. Their spouses were politically safe, divorced by decree of state. It was not just one name being forgotten. It was a family line unbraided from the scroll of Rome. Names struck through. Though rarely enforced with great fervor, it created a climate of caution. Graves left unmarked, or names chiseled away long after burial. Imagine the lonely tomb, no longer visited, no longer spoken of. Its story ending not in death, but in silence. To keep a memory alive was, for a time, a quiet act of rebellion. But to control the future, to shape how or if someone is remembered, the names drift back like soft echoes through time. Domitian, Geta, Elagabalus, Maximinus, their voices muted but still present. Beneath layers of stone and silence, titles rescinded. But they were real. Posthumous decrees noted the condemned had ceased to exist in official record, but what it meant to be erased, not killed. Let your thoughts drift to the empty base of a statue, to the hollow where a face used to be. Punishment, not through fire or blade, but through chisels and silence. Names peeled away like old paint, not with rage, but with indifference. Not punished. To the empire that moved forward, quieter now, with one less name to speak, simply removed. A name might be physically scratched out, the Latin letters carved deeply, but then carved again with careful gouges to make them unreadable. Sometimes new plaster would be poured over the stone, and fresh words etched atop it. Occasionally, if the inscription was low in importance, the stone itself would simply be discarded, broken, or buried. The work is just beginning. He raises his tool and strikes gently on monuments and coins, in voices and memories. A man who had once stood above the people in marble and praise could, within weeks, be rendered nameless, a blank spot in the timeline. This was the beginning of a process the Romans knew well. Let us walk through this fading together, step by step. The first act in a formal Damnatio Memoriae was a declaration, a vote in the Senate, or a decree from an emperor. The language was cold and formulaic. It stated that the person in question was no longer to be honored or remembered. From this moment forward, the public machinery of forgetting would begin. The most visible step was the removal of images. Statues, busts, reliefs, all were targeted. Public monuments, temples, libraries, even fountains. In whispered poems, in letters never meant to survive, we find fragments, the traces of those who were meant to disappear. Wherever the condemned person's likeness stood, it would be altered or destroyed. But here, the mechanics were trickier. Once coins entered circulation, they were difficult to track. Some would be melted down, others recalled and re-stamped. But most simply aged away. The condemned man's face, worn down by time and touch, softened into anonymity. But not all images were smashed. In many cases, recarving was the chosen method. The Romans were practical. Marble was costly. Labor was cheaper. A statue of Domitian could, with some effort, become Nerva. The nose reshaped, the hairstyle re-chiseled, the drapery lightly adjusted. If the body was neutral enough, only the head might be replaced, a common trick. A new identity sculpted over the old. The results were rarely perfect. In some cases, if you look closely, even today, you can see the faint echoes of the original. The sharpness of a jawline that dosing to match the new name, the leftover curve of a shoulder, too delicately carved to belong to the revised subject. Coins, too, were subject to removal. Next came inscriptions. You may imagine a scribe at work, not with hammer and chisel, but with ink. In the imperial archives, scrolls were altered. Public honors were next. Buildings named after the person would be renamed. Even private citizens, in some cases, were instructed to remove dedications in personal altars or domestic shrines. There are even cases of funerary inscriptions being erased. And so the erasure continued in layers, in city streets and imperial ledgers. But it was never truly perfect. In the cracks of altered inscriptions, modern archaeologists have found the shadows of old names. In the underlayers of reused stone, faint outlines. And in this, we find a strange paradox. The more Rome tried to forget, the more future generations tried to remember. There is something hauntingly human about it, isn't there? This desire not just to punish the body. And yet, forgetting is never complete. Even now, as you lie here, listening gently, the mechanics of forgetting were never perfect. And so, in this soft unraveling, we see the quiet cruelty of bureaucracy. In a moment, we'll move into the final part of this segment to ask not how Rome erased, to the families left behind, to the people who once loved the condemned. Let your breath slow again. The lives behind the silence, what it meant to be forgotten. The chisel stops. The artisan steps down from his scaffold. His hands are powdered with marble dust. Above him, the statue, once proud and clear-eyed, is now blank-faced. The work is complete, but what happens next when the tools are put away? When the orders have been followed, when the memory is gone? Her husband's name has been condemned. She has not been punished. She has not been exiled. She is simply alone. What does it mean to live in the shadow of erasure? Imagine now a woman, a mother, a sister, perhaps a wife. Her home quiet, the lamps lit low. In the market, vendors speak his name in whispers, or not at all. The magistrate avoids her gaze. His statue has been pulled down, the inscription at the family tomb scratched out, and yet he lived. She remembers. She remembers how he laughed, how he stood, how he thought too much or spoke too freely. She remembers the way his footsteps sounded when he returned home late, the way his eyes closed when he prayed. To remember someone who had been condemned was, itself, a kind of risk. The law says, forget. But memory, real memory, does not obey decrees. Out of fear, out of survival, their lips formed new names. The condemned would return, not in power, not in grandeur, but in recognition. A name spoken again, quietly, in a modern tongue. Their loyalties shifted. They recited the revised histories. They let the silence grow, quietly. Generations later, they would walk past the ruins, a pedestal with no statue, a half-scratched name, a house once belonging to someone important, though no one could quite recall who. A child keeping an old coin with his father's face, a friend preserving a letter, a slave whispering the old name during rites. Memory persisted in corners, in poems, in locked boxes beneath the floor. So she goes on, cooking the same dishes he liked, walking the same streets they once walked together, visiting, perhaps, the quiet grave that no longer bears his name. The grief she feels is not just of loss, but of erasure. Geta, Domitian, Elagabalus, you've heard their stories. However faint, however softened by distance and sleep, there is no mourning for the condemned, no public lamentation, no eulogy in the forum. The grief must be private, time itself remembered, imperfectly, incompletely, but stubbornly, soft, hidden behind closed doors. The scratching of his name, and the past has a long breath, the hush of the crowd, the steady official decision. He no longer existed. In some cases, the families were punished. In others, left untouched, but always watched, always observed for signs of resistance or memory. And so it lingers. Not like fire, but like fog. The relatives of the damned often found themselves caught in strange legal limbo. Were they still connected to him? Were they to be shamed? Protected? Some tried to resist, but it was dangerous. Others tried to forget. And then there were those who never knew the condemned at all. To them, the erasure became normal. A blank in the map of memory. A silence baked into the stones. But history is not so easily tamed. Centuries later, archaeologists and scholars would dust off old inscriptions, reveal hidden names beneath repainted busts, find traces in forgotten scrolls. And perhaps that is the final chapter of Damnatio Memoriae, the memory that cannot stay buried forever. There's a kind of melancholy comfort in that, isn't there? No matter how thoroughly Rome tried to forget, even as you lie here, in the quiet of your room, centuries away, you know their names. Their silence has been broken. And so we close this segment not with a verdict, but with a question. What does it mean to be remembered? And what does it mean to be forgotten? In the world of ancient Rome, it was not always death that marked the end of a man, but the decree that followed. But memory is stubborn. Let yourself rest in that thought. In a moment, we'll turn the page to a new form of punishment. Not erasure, but distance. Not silence, but exile. Exilium and relegatio. Banishment is a fate worse than death. There is a different kind of punishment, one that leaves no wound, spills no blood, and raises no sword. And yet, for many Romans, it was considered worse than death. They called it exilium, exile, not in the way we imagine today. No island prisons, no high walls, no shackles around the wrists. No, Roman exile was quiet. It was distance. He was relegatus, or worse, exul, driven from the heart of empire, separation. A man might be sent away for a few years, forbidden to enter Rome or certain cities, but still allowed to live elsewhere within the empire. It was quiet, clean, a pause in one's public life, a turning of the page without burning the book. He does not rage. There were no public scenes, no processions through the streets. It was delivered by letter or by messenger. Sometimes a man learned of his exile from a friend or a whisper in the Senate. He would quietly pack, a scholar to a town with no library, a general to a region without soldiers. Not pain, but incongruity. The stars even seemed to move in unfamiliar paths above you. The rhythms of your day, your morning walk, your evening meal, your position in society, all interrupted. Life continued, just not the life they had built. Those in exile could not freely send or receive messages. Their voices, too, were displaced. Or not. Some left at once, others hesitated, hoping for mercy. He does not accuse. Fewer voices. In the quiet of hills untouched by empire. In learning new customs, new dialects. In being, for the first time, anonymous. You're condemned to live. Just not quite as yourself. Efficient. They became different men. Not Romans anymore, but something else. Something between citizen and ghost. A man would disappear not with screams, but with travel. One day he was in the Senate. The next on a boat. In the sound of sandals on foreign roads. In the feeling of being looked at as an outsider, even when you carry the memory of marble halls in your bones. Then, gone. Listening to the sea wind, the hush of waves against the harbor stone. Somewhere, far away, Rome continues. But here, there is only distance. Not blood, not fire, but disconnection. Fewer books. Fewer paths to walk. Sometimes food was scarce. Sometimes company was forbidden. Other times, it was the silence that hurt more than anything. Pandateria. Names barely remembered now, but once known as prisons without walls. Augustus sent his own daughter Julia there, banished for her scandals. Others followed. Noblewomen, philosophers, dissenters. He simply misses Rome, its gardens, its voices, its stone stairways. His punishment was not torment. It was absence. The salt wind in his face, the smell of strange herbs and foreign markets. Voices that don't quite speak Latin in the way he remembers. His name might still be known, but only just. Lesser citizens, freedmen, even slaves could be banished from cities, districts, or entire provinces. A thief might be banned from a neighborhood. A former gladiator sent inland. away from the games. The geography of exile was complex, a quiet cartography of control, a slow drifting away from the rhythms of life that had once defined a person. To be exiled from Rome was to be unmade by space. Let yourself picture it. A Roman senator, once seated among marble pillars and golden togas, now walking a dusty shoreline far from the city. The sentence had already been passed. It carried the loss of property, of rank. Emperor Augustus had ordered his exile to the edge of the known world, to a windswept town called Thomas, on the shores of the Black Sea, cold, isolated, far from the warm baths and olive groves of Italy. Of civic identity, it was not just being sent away, it was being cut out, like a thread removed from a tapestry. In Roman law, there were two main forms of banishment. The first was relegatio, a softer form. It did not involve the loss of citizenship. It was not always permanent. But exilium, true exile, was harsher. The poet Ovid knew this well. One night, without trial, without warning, he was told to leave. Ovid never returned. His poems from exile are soft and sorrowful. Exile in Rome was rarely dramatic. But in the end, they went, often to places chosen specifically to diminish them, not merely in distance, but in dignity. A nobleman might be sent to a minor island. Imagine being removed from everything familiar, not by war, not by chaos, but by decree. The wines taste different. The bread feels coarse. Even letters were often censored. But exile was not only for the powerful, and there were islands. Small, wind-beaten specks in the sea. Pontia, Giaros. Life on these islands was not always cruel, but it was reduced. There is something deeply Roman about this form of punishment. It was not loud, it was not chaotic, it was orderly. His home rented out, his name spoken less and less. And yet, exile could also be a strange kind of freedom. Some exiles found peace in distance. A few returned. A few begged to. Others never tried. Perhaps that's the softest cruelty of exile. You're not condemned to die. And so we sit here, quietly, at the edge of empire. In this place, punishment is not delivered by blade or chain, but by space. Let your thoughts settle gently here. In the slow rhythm of exile, this was Rome's softer sentence. Life on the outskirts of the empire. There is something curiously still about the forgotten edges of the Roman world, not the chaos of conquest, nor the grandeur of marble temples, not just physically removed from Rome, but slowly, imperceptibly disconnected from its breath, as though the rhythm of the city no longer reached them, as though they were living in a parallel time that moved slower, fainter, quieter. But the long, wind-bent stretches of coastline, rather, it unfolded in days that blended gently into one another. A life that was neither fully alive in the civic sense. They were often brief, carefully worded, shaped to avoid offense. Censors could read them. So most chose not to say too much, just enough to confirm the continuation of breath. I am well. The weather is cold, the crops are late, the days are long. I think of Rome sometimes, but for some, there was also peace in being left alone. Now waking before dawn in a modest stone house near the Black Sea, a new emperor took power. A name was forgiven. Into unfamiliar landscapes, into half-lives of memory, was not about pain or rage or spectacle. It was about distance. It was about disconnection. It was about continuing on, but always elsewhere. Not erased like those subject to Damnatio Memoriae, but faded, like ink exposed too long to sun, like footprints after a soft rain. Their stories continued in pieces, in footnotes, in marginalia. Not lost entirely, but folded gently into the quiet margins of history. A decree reversed. And so, a man would pack his few things older now. How to make a man disappear, not by silencing him, but by placing him where his voice would no longer echo. Greyer can journey back toward the city that had once expelled him, but it was never the same. Rome had changed, and he had changed. He might return to find his house sold, his friends gone, his memory faded from the streets where once he walked proudly. He would see his name spoken with confusion, or perhaps faint recognition. Was he not the one? Yes, I think he was. Whatever happened to him? Wrapped in a warm wool cloak. Others walked, endlessly, repetitively, circling the same hills each day, as if retracing the geography of memory. A few drank more than they should. Others wrote poetry, like Ovid, filling the void with words that no one nearby understood, their verses floating into the sea air and vanishing, listening to the cries of seabirds instead of the bustle of the forum, marking the Saturnalia with a quiet toast, a quiet kind of punishment unfolded, not sharp, not sudden, but soft and unrelenting, like a door that was never quite closed, but could never fully open again, even when no one else celebrated. But over time, these efforts thinned. The endless demands of politics, the ceaseless calculations of alliances and favors, the noise of public life, all of that was gone. There were no rivals, no schemes, only the landscape, the seasons, and the occasional letter that might or might not arrive. Traditions faded. The connection loosened, like a knot slowly working its way, undone, but distant. They knew it only through stories, of palaces and aqueducts, of festivals and forums, of a world made of stone and ceremony, unreachable and possibly imagined. And to the parents, this distance became even heavier. To speak of the capital was to speak of a self that no longer existed. An exiled Roman, especially one of noble birth, was often treated like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Respected, perhaps, but never truly welcomed, never quite at home, pouring wine that lacks the sweetness of Latium's vineyards, eating bread that crumbles differently in the mouth, not because it is poor in quality. No victories, no honors, only the passage of time, soft, persistent, indifferent. But because it is unfamiliar, and it is this unfamiliarity, repeated daily, that gnaws more than hunger ever could, nor dead in the bodily sense, but suspended in between, were not simply moved, they were untethered. Like ships cast from harbors without destination, left to drift in corners of the empire where their names meant nothing, and their achievements earned only puzzled nods from villagers more concerned with weather and crops than with politics or poetry. Like smoke that has no wind to disperse it, the sleepy hill towns with narrow paths, the border provinces where Latin was spoken with a hesitant accent, and where news from the capital arrived only in fragments, their clothes shifted subtly. Their days became local, and though the empire technically included them still, their hearts became exiles too, caught in the tension between memory and adaptation, between longing and resignation, like broken pottery washed ashore. It was in places like these that the exiled found themselves. Life on the outskirts was not marked by violence or fire. Imagine a Roman senator, once immersed in the schedules of law and ritual. These men and women, once integrated into the very bones of Roman society, in time, their Latin grew accented. Letters, when allowed, took weeks to arrive, and longer to be answered. And what did these exiles do with their time? Some studied, trying to preserve their minds in scrolls and thought. The locals, for the most part, were polite. Children born in exile sometimes never saw Rome. Some tried to recreate a piece of Rome, building small courtyards in foreign soil, keeping rituals alive in cramped rooms. There was no applause in exile. And yet, there was also survival. Some who had been exiled found a kind of stillness in the simplicity of rural life. There was pain in being forgotten. Occasionally, someone returned. Even in return, exile lingered. And for those who never returned, their names slowly dissolved. And so the punishment of exile, that slow drifting into the outer provinces Rome, for all its glory, knew. And in those places, on windswept islands, in lonely hill towns, on foreign roads, why exile was so common for intellectuals. In Rome, words were weighty things. A single sentence, well-crafted, carefully placed, could shift the mood of a crowd, redirect the thoughts of a senator, or in some cases, threaten the shape of an entire regime. When emperors grew suspicious, not imprisonment, not execution, but distance, that familiar Roman answer to discomfort. A way to silence, without silencing directly. Lonely, yearning, formal. Not bitter, that would have been dangerous, but laced with sorrow. To the island of Corsica he went, removed from the pulse of politics. Politics in Rome, after all, was never about moral clarity. It was about balance. His letters during this period are reflective, stripped of pretense. He wrote not only to advise others, but to endure his own distance. He considered mortality. It was a negotiation between what had happened and what could safely be said. A well-chosen adjective might tilt a reputation, and for the intellectual, exile often became a second school, a place where thoughts deepened, where language sharpened. Emperors liked poets until the poems pointed too sharply. They admired philosophers until the philosophy made them seem small. They appreciated historians, especially if those historians remembered only what was convenient. Far from Rome's crowded theaters and marble courtyards, the mind had room to echo. A hesitation in chronology could imply dissent. By sending its sharpest minds away, it gave them quiet, it gave them distance, it gave them time. Too bold, and a writer might find himself accused of sedition. Too cautious, and his words might be ignored entirely. Not fire. When he feared thought, he wrote a letter. The philosopher, the poet, the scholar, they would vanish from the city, not in shame, but in silence. Not pain, but air, space, horizon. And in that stillness, ideas had room to stretch. Vanity, the brevity of favor. And with the subtle power of a man who still wielded words, even when their reach had been shortened. Seneca's meditations on life and death are still quoted in whispered tones of awe. The thoughts formed in exile, purified by solitude, stripped of performance, became some of the most enduring. It was not always the soldier or the rebel who faced punishment, but whose positions in life were always somewhat uncertain. A master of Stoic thought, he taught calm, measured control of the self. But even calm can be threatening when paired with clarity. It was often the philosopher, the poet, the historian, those who, with calm voices and clever metaphors, revealed truths that were meant to stay politely obscured. The pen may not have drawn blood, but its reach, its subtlety, its ability to unmake certainties, that was feared. And so, when power felt uneasy, exile became the answer. It is no accident that so many intellectuals of Rome's long life spent part of that life far from the city's stone heart. Some, like the poet Ovid, were exiled under mysterious pretexts. He famously referred to his downfall as carming it error, a poem and a mistake, not tried, not publicly humiliated, just quietly dispatched to Thomas, a town whose very name felt distant on the tongue. The poem, we know, is Ars Amatoria, a seductive, elegant guide to the arts of love, perhaps too elegant for Augustus' moral reforms. The mistake he never named. Scholars still wonder, was it a political slight? A personal offense? A moment witnessed that was never meant to be seen? Whatever the cause, he was sent away. There, far from the Senate and the publishers of Rome, he wrote elegies. Others, like the philosopher Seneca, experienced exile more than once. Accused of an affair with Julia Livilla, whether fairly or not, Seneca was sent away by Emperor Claudius. Years later, he would be recalled, not because he was forgiven, but because he was useful. And then there were the historians, those cautious recorders of Rome's stories. Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Suetonius, writers whose works would survive centuries. The act of writing history in Rome was not a quiet one. Exile became a kind of release valve, a way for the state to rid itself of voices without bloodshed. The relationship between Roman power and Roman intellect was always tense. Thus, exile became a tool not of cruelty, but of containment. The intellectual was not a soldier to be defeated. He was a lamp to be dimmed. Exile did just that. It dulled the voice. It changed the audience. It turned a shout into a murmur. And yet, in some cases, the murmur survived. Ovid's Tristia, his poems from exile, outlived the emperor who sent him away. One must wonder if the Roman state, in trying to silence dissent, inadvertently preserved it. A dangerous gift. There's a stillness in this kind of punishment. When an emperor feared rebellion, he called the army. And so the ship would leave the harbor. Rome would move on. But the words, carefully chosen, written in dim lamplight on rough parchment, those would wait. There were those who left Rome with resignation in their step, and others who left with a flicker of hope that one day the gates would open again, and their names would be spoken not in whispers, but aloud. The return from exile was never promised. It depended on the tides of politics, on the favor of emperors, on time itself, dulling the sting of whatever misstep or offense had caused the banishment. Some sent letters. Some sent gifts. Others sent silence, hoping it would be read as loyalty. And sometimes the door opened again. The poet Ovid, though he wrote endlessly from Taurus, never found that passage home. The Empress Agrippina saw in him a mind worth having close, and so he was recalled, named tutor to her son, the young Nero. For a time, Seneca stood again within the marble halls of influence. But even then, he must have known that return did not mean restoration. The chaotic collapses of emperors. A return often depended on who now sat on the throne. New rulers, eager to distance themselves from their predecessors, might invite back those the former regime had banished. It was not forgiveness, but strategy. To hear Latin not spoken as a second tongue, but as a living rhythm. To feel the warm stone of the city beneath their feet after years of unfamiliar dust and wind. Even if they were never fully welcomed, they were home. And home, even changed, was better than absence. It was never a full restoration. There were no clean slates in Rome, only new inscriptions layered over older ones, the stone showing faint signs of what had once been carved there before. And the returning exile knew this. They did not speak often of where they had gone or what they had endured. Their exile became a private shadow, not denied, but not displayed. They resumed their lives with care, knowing how easily a name could be removed from memory again. Gratitude was expected, but not always genuine. Every decree, both a sentence and a possibility. The return from exile did not erase the years spent apart, but it softened them, buried them beneath new routines, new alliances, and a quieter presence in the city they once called home. It meant obligation, vigilance, a second life balanced delicately on the winds of youth and power. They attempted to restore their reputations. It did not forget entirely. Even as their names were spoken again, there were always traces, old slanders, lingering suspicions, the quiet question in the eyes of those who passed them in the streets. Either the invitation never came, or the desire had vanished. Letters circulated, poems shared, philosophies studied. And so, even without stepping again through the gates of Rome, their thoughts returned, layered over the very structures that had once cast them out. They had built new lives, quieter lives, lives beyond the shadow of imperial favor. To return would be to risk losing what little peace they had found in the silence, to rewrite the story of their banishment. Through carefully constructed letters, through reappearing in public discourse, through aligning themselves with rising political stars, they sought not just to return, but to return as someone unbroken. Each elegy he sent carried with it a subtle petition, not just for forgiveness, but for acknowledgement. Their names were reinscribed, their statues restored, not by decree, but by later generations who reconsidered their exile as unjust. These were not restorations for the man, but for the memory of the man. Posterity stepping in where contemporaries had failed. The years passed, and the tone of his writing grew softer, less confident, more fragile. He died still in exile, and yet his words found their way back to Rome. The man who returned was never quite the man who had left. Time passed differently on the outskirts of empire. Their names spoken once more in the Senate with cautious respect. But the stain of absence lingered. There were always those who remembered why they had been sent away in the first place. The world he came back to had changed. Or perhaps he had changed, and the city had remained the same, indifferent to his scars. His books, quietly recopied, were once again read in the schools and salons. The poet never walked the forum again, but his verses did. Others were more fortunate. Seneca, exiled under Claudius, returned not by accident, but by utility. There was risk in coming back. Some were recalled with ceremony, titles reinstated, property returned, for those who had fallen out of favor during times of civil unrest, during transitions of power, shifts of allegiance. A few tried to reclaim more than just their homes. But memory in Rome was layered. And yet, for some, the return was enough to walk once more beneath the aqueducts. There were also those who refused to return. Some left behind writings that carried their voices back in their place. And there were those whose return was partial. The act of returning was never simple. It was not a journey, but a negotiation between past and present, between punishment and perception. And still, some faded quietly into the fabric of the city. Rome offered the illusion of permanence, but it was, in truth, a city of thresholds. Every arch was both entry and exit. Their voices, though changed, still echoed. The city, even with all its silence, had room again for their footsteps. Public executions as controlled theater. There is a stillness that descends over a crowd just before a performance begins. A hush, collective and unspoken. A breath held. In the Roman world, this same stillness gathered not only before plays or recitations, but before a very different kind of spectacle. One where the stage was made of sand, the audience of citizens, and the actors of condemned men. Justice in Rome was not confined to courtroom walls or sealed scrolls. It was not always quiet, nor always private. In many cases, it was enacted beneath the open sky. For treason, death might come swiftly, but not without words. The accused was made to stand and hear the charge one last time. For serious theft or banditry, the execution might be more public. A cross erected beyond the city walls, the man bound for all to see. But to recognize the structure they followed, staged, scheduled, and deeply symbolic, every element had its place. This was not mercy, but optics. The state preferred its patricians to disappear with dignity, without the disorder of public distress. The result was the same, but the scene was controlled. Or the lesser amphitheaters throughout the provinces, executions were folded into the schedule of entertainment. After the animal hunts, before the gladiatorial duels, the early republic had its own rituals, executions carried out with grim formality. The empire, with its vast stage and need for order, simply refined the process, codified it, and added marble columns and trumpets. The crime was forgotten. In ritual, in structure, a figure collapsing in the dust before a quiet crowd. Even their punishments were part of a wider architecture, one that placed every citizen on a path, and made sure that every misstep was marked not just with consequence, but with meaning. Sometimes they grew restless. Sometimes they turned their faces away, and sometimes they cheered, not out of cruelty, but out of participation. Justice was not abstract. To show the cost of stepping beyond the boundaries that held the city together, it was lived. It was seen. The punishment became the focus. And yet, beneath the blood and applause, a message remained clear. This is what happens to those who threaten order. A father, a former friend, and to them, the performance was not enough to erase the person beneath it. There would be the damnatio bestias, the condemned sent to face wild beasts unarmed as the crowd looked on. Not performance in the sense of acting, but in the sense of presence, of being seen. Rome wanted punishment to be felt not only by the condemned, but by those who watched. Some were simple. A sword drawn across the throat. A fall from the Tarpeian rock, the steep cliff reserved for traitors, the wind catching their final breath as they fell. In these cases, it was not the violence that mattered, but the symbolism, the fall from honor. They had seen what the state could do. They had heard the decrees read aloud. They had witnessed the moment a man ceased to be a citizen and became an example, the removal from the city's memory and from its earth. Every punishment its audience, where the full weight of punishment could be seen, not only by the punished, but by those who watched and by those who remembered. A man might be sentenced in the basilica, the formal halls of legal procedure, but his final moments would often take place before thousands, beneath the canopy of the arena. And it is here, amid applause and silence, that the idea of theater, not of fiction, escorted by guards, their spears held not for use, but for presence. Sometimes it is a festival day, the execution one piece among many, races, music, contests. The method of death, the timing, the language used by officials, all are scripted. The sentence may have been passed days or weeks earlier. The delay is not a kindness, but part of the rhythm. A punishment delayed is not a punishment forgotten. It is anticipated. Other times it is the sole event, the city's attention narrowed to a single point. The crowds do not scream, nor do they cheer, not yet. They observe, they witness. This is not chaos. It is a procession of control, but of deliberate display, takes root in the Roman concept of law. To understand Roman executions as performance is not to trivialize their severity. Imagine, if you will, the slow procession of a condemned prisoner through the streets. By the time he reaches the forum or the amphitheater, the crowd has gathered. What follows is not spontaneous. Different crimes called for different treatments. And then there were the games. In the grand arenas, the Colosseum in Rome, it is here that justice and spectacle blurred most vividly. But not all executions were brutal. Occasionally, a man of status was given a choice to die by his own hand at home, in quiet. What tied all these forms together, the arena, the rock, the silent house, was performance. Because in watching, they would learn. They would feel the invisible thread that connected them to the law, not through fear alone, but through familiarity. This system was not built overnight. It evolved over generations, shaped by culture, by conquest, and by necessity. The crowds were not always pleased. And still, in the corners of the crowd, there were always those who watched with silence, who remembered not the spectacle, but the man. The Romans believed in order, a meaning carved into stone, a name removed from the rolls. Punishment in Rome was not always designed to hurt. It was designed to instruct. And so the theater of justice continued, not as chaos, but as ceremony. No curtain ever fell, only silence. Punishing the collective for individual failure, in the long corridors of Roman discipline, there existed a punishment unlike any other, not designed to punish a single man for his own actions, lived not just by strategy and strength, but by obedience. A legion moved not because it was told to. Even in Rome, it was considered a measure of last resort, too damaging to morale to be used carelessly, too brutal to repeat without thought. But it remained in the military lexicon for centuries. Its mere possibility hung over the ranks like a silent warning. But because each soldier understood his place, in rank, in motion, in consequence. But even the most disciplined forces frayed. Loyalty bent. Often, the condemned were beaten, by fists, by clubs, by whatever was available. The process was slow, exhausting, intimate. They might be made to camp outside the defenses, sleep without cover, dig ditches, or haul stone. Their shame became labor. It could, however, afford to lose 10% if that sacrifice would restore the balance. Their obedience reforged in humiliation. And when it ended, the bodies were left for all to see. There were no shrouds, no funerals. After a series of failures by his legions, he ordered the decimation of one entire cohort. The act was swift, methodical, and effective. Used too late, it lost meaning. It was not meant to teach the laws. It was meant to teach fear. The engine of Rome moved on, one step at a time. The survivors quiet. The absence felt not in the noise, but in the space left behind by those who would not return, reinforced by rituals of punishment as much as rituals of victory. And perhaps that was the point. The Roman army knew no mercy, not even for itself. The rebellion was crushed not long after. But the memory of that moment, when Roman soldiers turned on Roman soldiers, remained long after the final battle had passed. And he knew, too, that his hand might have ended a life moments earlier. That weight was not easily shed. It lingered in the silences between orders, in the way men looked at one another afterward. Just absence and silence. And within each group, one would be selected, randomly, impartially. A drawing of stones or a marked token in a jar. But the burden placed on those who survived. To kill a brother in arms, Polybius describes it. Livy recounts variations. Even in the writings of later commanders, the threat of decimation lingered. Perhaps no longer carried out, but always remembered. The word itself became a kind of spell, whispered through the ranks when discipline faltered. To carry out the sentence with your own hands, it ensured that punishment was not distant, not delegated, but shared. It was not about killing the guilty. It was about making the entire group complicit, binding them together not with trust, but with consequence. No appeals, no replacements. 1 in 10, that man would be executed by the remaining 9. Fear crept in. And when mutiny threatened the order, or cowardice had taken root, the generals needed a punishment severe enough to restore authority, yet so structured, so orderly, that it could not be mistaken for rage, but to weigh heavily on a group, to bend the will of many through the suffering of a few. It was called decimatio. Decimation, a quiet word whose shape suggests precision, but whose effect was blunt, unrelenting, and profoundly calculated. When a cohort, a group of roughly 480 soldiers, had disgraced itself, whether by desertion, by cowardice in battle, or by mutiny, the commanding officer could order a decimation. The men would be assembled. The charge read aloud. The punishment declared. The Roman army, that vast and tireless machine of conquest, that punishment was decimation. It did not happen often. The procedure was precise. Then the lot would be cast. In groups of 10, the soldiers stood together. Not by strangers, by comrades. This was the heart of the punishment, not the death itself. Weapons were not always used. The surviving men, their number reduced, would be given rations of barley instead of wheat. A symbolic reduction in status, sustenance made harsh. Decimation was not intended to destroy a unit. It was intended to cleanse it. The army could not afford to lose hundreds. It was most famously employed by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthy triumvir, during the campaign against Spartacus in 71 BCE. There are other accounts scattered through the histories. What made the punishment so effective was not its cruelty. There were more painful deaths in the Roman world, but its symbolism. The soldier who survived a decimation knew that his life had been spared not by merit, but by chance. For commanders, it was a tool that walked the edge of control. Used too lightly, it destroyed morale. Yet the legions continued to fight. There is a stillness in imagining the moments after such a sentence. The dust settled, the sun still hanging above the camp. Decimation was rare, but that rarity made it powerful. A single instance could echo for years. No soldier forgot it. Military-specific shame and punishment, in the long shadow of Roman discipline, beyond the executions and the decimations, there lived quieter forms of punishment, less final, less visible, but deeply wounding. These were not meant to kill a man, or even to remove him entirely. A soldier might be required to stand outside the camp all night, fully armed, without food or rest, exposed to the chill and the dark, while his comrades slept inside the protected lines. A centurion, once commanding 100 men, could find himself returned to the status of a common legionary, his seat at the officer's table taken. A man suspected of cowardice, or of failing to support his fellow soldiers in battle, might find himself isolated in the camp. No shared meals, no friendly games, averted eyes. The Roman legion was a brotherhood, but it was a hard brotherhood, and the cold shoulder could be more cutting than the lash. His privileges revoked, and yet feel broken, not by the enemy. The Roman military also allowed for recovery. A soldier who endured his punishment, who performed with renewed vigor, who proved himself in the next campaign, could earn back his standing. In the silence of an empty tent, in the dust of a newly dug trench, these reminders were lived. The same hands that struck could also lift. The same voices that whispered scorn could whisper praise. Shame, in Rome, was not always a death sentence. It was a season, long, cold, and lonely, but not always permanent. But by the gaze of his fellow soldiers, nor of forgiveness, but of tension. A soldier was not only punished to suffer, he was punished to remember, to reflect, to rebuild. Who knew what he had done, or what he had failed to do? Reputation was not held in medals alone. It lived in stories, in nicknames, in glances exchanged at the water basin or the fireside. Disgrace followed like smoke. A soldier could be forced to eat standing, with his hands behind his back, an image of animal-like submission. These men were often treated as less refined, more expendable. Their errors, even when minor, might be met with harsher labor, extended service, or flogging. Its strength came from the ground beneath the soldier as feet, from the certainty that each man in the line knew his place, and the quiet understanding that if he forgot it, the reminders would come swiftly and without warmth, which, though frowned upon among citizens, remained a possibility for those on the margins. He could be denied salt in his rations, a small but bitter reminder that even the basic flavors of life could be withheld. Some were assigned to dig graves, not for use, but as a symbolic preparation, a way of reminding the man of his place and how quickly it could be lost. The orders he once gave, now received. The loss was not merely logistical. A soldier could be ordered not to speak, not for a fixed period, but indefinitely, until his commanding officer saw fit to restore his voice. This was not literal muteness, of course, but a restriction from speaking aloud in camp, in meetings, in formation. A symbolic erasure of his presence, rendering him invisible not in body, but in sound. It was a collapse of position, of self-understanding. He might be ordered to carry extra weight on the march, or to clean latrines alone. These tasks were not merely unpleasant, they were public. The unit saw, the unit remembered. Every flaw was a potential rupture. Every crack in discipline a threat to the entire formation. And so, punishment extended beyond the body, into the realms of pride, identity, and memory. They were meant to shape him, to mark him, to press the weight of shame into his armor, his name, his every movement. They were symbols of valor, awarded for bravery, endurance, or loyalty. To be stripped of them, sometimes in front of the entire cohort, was not just a demotion. It was a symbolic unmaking of reputation. A man walked away not just lighter in weight, but reduced in spirit. The Roman soldier, for all his strength, was never free from the invisible lines drawn by tradition, expectation, and fear. And when those lines were crossed, punishment followed, not always with blood, but with disgrace. The Roman army was a living structure, its strength found in repetition and regulation. To serve was not simply to fight, but to inhabit a role. Every detail, the angle of the shield, the cut of the tunic, the stride of the march, was measured. Precision was pride. And when that pride was broken, when a man failed in duty or allowed cowardice to take hold, he could be broken in return, not with sword or lash, but with humiliation. The mildest punishments were corrections of behavior, but more severe forms of disgrace targeted the soldier's honor, that quiet, internal flame that held the Roman military identity intact. One such punishment was the removal of foliae, the decorative medals and ornaments worn on the chest. They were not just for show. Another was gradus diectio, the lowering of rank. For some, the punishment came not in formal discipline, but in informal ostracism. There were symbolic punishments as well. Among the auxiliaries, non-citizen troops from the provinces, the punishments could be harsher still. One of the most curious punishments involved silence. The Roman military did not believe in small transgressions. A man could return from battle with all his limbs intact, and yet, for all this harshness, it is in this balance that the Roman system revealed its deeper structure. A system not purely of cruelty, even as the empire stretched across mountains and seas. In the flicker of torchlight at a quiet camp's edge, forcing suicide and death through shame. There were deaths in ancient Rome that never appeared in the official records. No sword was drawn, no judgment read aloud, no executioner summoned. And yet, these deaths were real, their silence just as deliberate. It knew how to apply force with a subtler hand, through dishonor, through isolation, through the slow erosion of reputation, until the condemned made their own decision. Not under orders, but because no other path remained. A summons. A quiet visit from a soldier or court official, bearing no visible threat, only a message. The emperor is displeased. Charges have been raised. The Senate has debated. No sentence yet, but one is expected. You might wish to prepare. Was among the most famous victims of this unspoken sentence. Accused of involvement in a conspiracy he likely knew little of, he was given no trial, only a suggestion, and the presence of armed men outside his door. A man's estate would not be seized if he died by his own hand, rather than by execution. His family would not be tainted with legal infamy. His name, though dimmed, might remain on the record. Their outcome just as final. To be executed often led to disgrace that spread like ink through parchment, touching not just the accused, but his wife, his children, his entire lineage. Some hesitated. Even military leaders, provincial governors, and wealthy citizens could feel its weight. It crept through the ranks of the privileged like a thin mist, silent, cool, inevitable, of masculinity, of public image. The performance of one's death became an extension of one's life, judged, remembered, or forgotten according to how well the exit was managed. Some despaired. Some tried to flee. Their ends were no less final, but lacked the ritual calm that Roman writers preferred to describe. These were stories left half-told, or dressed up after the fact to better fit the ideal. He did not resist. He bathed. The Senate met. The Forum bustled. Later emperors, more secure in their authority, or more theatrical in their cruelty, returned to public trials, to visible punishment. But the undercurrent remained, the understanding that sometimes the most effective punishment is the one that needs no proclamation. The names, when mentioned, were accompanied by a brief nod. He died well, they would say, which meant not bravely or righteously, but without resistance, but which arose from the same pressures. A general recalled in disgrace. a senator whose allies had fallen, a former favorite of the emperor, now left out of the inner circle. These men saw what waited for them, and chose instead to step aside quietly before the sentence arrived. He opened his veins. When the bleeding slowed, he drank poison. When that too failed, he was placed in a steam room to speed the process. The sources tell this story not with horror, but with restraint. It was noble, they say. To live under the state's gaze was to submit, but to choose one's death, even under duress, was to reclaim a fragment of autonomy, however illusory, a stoic's death. But beneath the narrative of dignity lies the simple truth. Seneca was made to die without being formally condemned. They were carried out not by decree, but by design, shaped by pressure, by humiliation, by that most Roman of forces, the unbearable weight of honor. Rome did not always need to kill directly. Speak with his family, carefully, distantly. Write a will. Sometimes he would host a final dinner, a strange Roman custom that blurred the line between farewell and ritual. Friends would gather, knowing what approached, but pretending for a time that it was only a meal, but that they would do so with composure, that they would write a final line, speak a final phrase, and depart without scandal. This was the quiet art of induced suicide, a practice both acknowledged and concealed. Officially, there was no blood on the state's hands. Unofficially, the system had accomplished precisely what it intended. Not for defense, not for appeal, but for death. It often began with a letter, and so the man prepared. He would arrange his affairs, particularly under rulers like Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. For these emperors, especially, public trials were inconvenient. They risked detention, sympathy, even resistance. A quiet exit served better. The bath was drawn, the body cleaned, the room quieted, and the act itself carried out with solemnity. Often by opening the veins in the wrist or thigh, the Roman method preferred for its dignity, its steadiness. There was no panic, only inevitability. This pattern played out countless times during the early empire. The philosopher Seneca, once a tutor and advisor to Nero, he did not plead. This method allowed the state to avoid formal charges while still eliminating perceived threats. It preserved the illusion of law, even as it bypassed its mechanics. To die by suicide under pressure was seen, strangely, as an honorable exit. It preserved property, in many cases. The alternative? To resist, to be dragged through trial. And so many chose what seemed the lesser of two shadows. There were also informal suicides, deaths that were not directly requested. The expectation was not only that they would die. For the Roman elite, this control over one's exit was a last domain of power. Still, not all deaths were peaceful. The pressure to die was not reserved for men of letters or politics. And while the victims disappeared, Rome continued. This system of silent execution was not written in law books. It was built into the culture, into the expectations of citizenship. Over time, the practice grew less formal. It is strange to consider how many deaths in Roman history were not murders, nor judgments, but invitations. Invitations to leave before being pushed, to vanish with a whisper rather than a cry. Punishments encoded into Roman law. The laws of Rome were etched not only in stone tablets and scrolls, but in the lives of those who lived beneath them. Beneath the veneer of grandeur and philosophical wisdom, Roman legal structures often revealed something colder. It was a ladder, and where you stood on it determined the nature of your rights, your punishments, even your capacity to testify in court. At the top were the patricians, the elite class whose names shaped the city's history. Below them, the plebeians, the commoners. Then the freedmen, those once enslaved, now technically free, but still shadowed by their former status. A slave, unless tortured, could not. Roman law considered slaves inherently untrustworthy. Their words alone, unworthy of belief. And so, to ensure the truth, pain was made the medium. Adultery laws, for instance, fell most heavily on women, particularly those of high status. A man might stray and suffer social disapproval. A woman might lose her property, her family, and her freedom. Under Augustus' reforms, the Lex Julia de Adulteries required husbands to report their wives for adultery, or else be prosecuted themselves. A strange calculus of shame imposed by decree. This was not seen as cruelty. It was process. It was codified. Another might declare that a man who sold a defective ox had 7 days to offer a replacement. Another might reduce the penalty for beating a woman. Simply present, as natural as the cobbled streets or the columns of the Forum, provided she was not of noble blood. Even those who broke the law did so knowing the structure they defied. Even those who suffered beneath it often accepted its terms, because they had never known another world. It was consistent. But its consistency was built not on justice, but on category. The citizens quoting statutes. The slaves waiting to be called, or dismissed, or punished. The law asked not what was done, but who had done it. To whom? They argued that a slave, too, possessed a soul. That virtue was not limited by class. These ideas spread, slowly, quietly. A sharp tool wielded by those who believed it kept chaos at bay. But the law changed only when the state was ready. It shifted. It evolved. But it never stopped counting, weighing men not by who they were, but by where they stood. In what context? With what rank? Expected. Explained away in neat legal Latin. And at the bottom, the slaves, legal property, not persons, governed by a separate layer of rules altogether. Jurists like Ulpian and Gaius wrote volumes, not to question the nature of law, but to clarify its layers. They defined the punishment for forging coins, the process for accusing a guardian of theft, the correct method of transferring a slave between owners. The language was elegant, detached, clean. Utility was something sharper, a calculated logic that did not seek to understand suffering. The condemned was sewn into a sack with a rooster, a dog, a monkey, and a snake, then thrown into the river. Each animal chosen for symbolic reasons. Each movement choreographed by the law, as if death were not sufficient without ritual. But to categorize it, to measure it, debt could lead to bondage, imprisonment, or forced labor. And in times of famine or crisis, theft of grain could carry the same sentence as assault, and to assign it according to class, status, and utility. The law was not blind. It saw quite clearly, and what it saw most was difference. At the center of this legal world stood the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest code, composed in the 5th century BCE, a crystallization of custom into formal decree. Later expansions brought in the Lex Cornelia, the Lex Julia, and countless others. These laws governed everything, from contracts and property to marriage and murder. But they also served another purpose, to define who was fully human in the eyes of the state, and who was not. The Roman legal system was not a field of equality. For those at the top, punishment could be moderated by wealth or influence, or the quiet turning of a magistrate's gaze. A senator convicted of corruption might face exile. A noble caught in adultery might receive a warning or a forced divorce. But further down the ladder, the consequences grew harsher. A freedman, unable to speak for himself against his former master. A plebeian thief, sentenced to hard labor in the mines. A slave who raised a hand to a citizen, beaten without limit. The laws were clear, but not equal. One of the clearest examples of this divide was the treatment of testimony. A free man could speak in court. In this way, the law became a mirror for the values of the state: efficiency, hierarchy, and control. Compassion was not a legal principle. There were punishments, too, reserved for very specific groups. In cases of parricide, the killing of a parent The punishment was uniquely Roman. In the countryside, lesser crimes received lesser sentences, but these were no gentler. Branding, whipping, mutilation, loss of land. The law was not without logic. The state did not need to be fair. It needed to be stable. And so legal texts were copied, debated, interpreted. But behind each clause was a life altered or ended. A law might specify that a runaway slave could be whipped by any citizen who found him. And slowly, through centuries, these rules formed a lattice of daily life, not always noticed, not always questioned. To live in Rome was to live within this system, sometimes protected by it, sometimes punished by it, but never entirely outside of it. And yet, not all voices were silent. Some philosophers, especially the Stoics, wrote of universal brotherhood, of reason shared by all. For most, the law remained what it had always been, and so the city continued. The magistrates in their red-edged togas, the scribes with their wax tablets, the couriers moving between courts. The law did not sleep. In the Roman world, truth was not always something uncovered through reason, evidence, or quiet reflection. Sometimes, truth had to be extracted, drawn out not in words, but in cries. They had no legal personhood. It was process. A formal step, like stamping a document or presenting an official seal. The logic behind it was both simple and chilling. Slaves, they believed. A wealthy man is accused of plotting against the emperor. Their pain, ironically, would be read as honesty. But a word screamed through pain. In cases of theft, adultery, poisoning, conspiracy, and even property disputes, the testimony of slaves could be demanded, so long as it was extracted the proper way. There were procedures, formalities. Most broke. Most gave answers. And whether those answers were true or not, they were used. Because truth, once recorded under torture, became part of the judicial record. A master could request that his slaves not be tortured, but only under rare conditions and with high connections. The law did not bend for affection. Irrevocable, unquestioned. In some tomb inscriptions, freed slaves thanked their former owners for protecting them from torture. Centuries passed. Emperors rose and fell. But the quaestio per tormenta remained in use, because the system that required it remained unchanged. In rare moments of poetry and prose, the pain of the process was described, not graphically, but with metaphor, fire, iron, silence. The torturer was often a slave himself, trained not to question, but to elicit. And for those born into bondage, the law was never a shield. Served, listened, and hoped that no one nearby would commit a crime. For even innocence in that world could be made painful. It was a sentence, one that could be activated at any time, with or without cause, with or without guilt. And once a statement had been forced, it was written down, not as a product of coercion, but as a finding. That, the law said, was trustworthy. When a noblewoman was found murdered, those who endured the pain and refused to speak, not because they were innocent, but because they had chosen their silence. Roman writers occasionally mention these slaves with a tone of reluctant respect. Not admiration, exactly, but awe, that someone so low in status, so disposable in the eyes of the law, could still summon the strength to die with secrets intact. It unsettled the Roman belief that virtue belonged only to citizens. Her kitchen staff, those who cooked her last meal, might all be questioned. If a senator's documents were leaked, his scribes might be brought in one by one, bound and stripped, and asked the same questions until someone broke. Sometimes they all did. He denies it. His friends deny it. But his slaves, those who serve his meals, the slave might be executed. No revision of evidence. No recognition that pain distorts memory, clouds judgment, bends the will. The Romans did not pretend that torture was just. They only insisted that it worked. or, if they were considered particularly useful, returned to the household, changed, scarred, silent. Arrange his papers, carry his letters, are summoned, not to give speeches. It was daily fear, to be near a crime, to hear a secret, to know something that others did not. All of this carried the weight of danger. A household might seem calm on the surface, but underneath, every servant knew that knowledge was not power. It was liability, not to stand before the magistrate, but to be tied, questioned, and broken if necessary. Would lie to protect their masters, and only pain would force the truth free. No right to testify, no standing in court. If a slave witnessed a crime, their word could not be admitted on its own. If a master was accused of a serious offense, depending on the severity of the case and the status of those involved. The tools varied: wooden racks, cords, hot plates, metal hooks, each designed not to kill, but to elicit. The torturer was not an executioner, but a technician. His job was not punishment, it was verification. The slave's account, even if truthful, would be considered void unless it was drawn from them through torment. Among those with no legal standing, no right to speak freely, no presumption of honesty in the eyes of the court, truth was presumed to reside not in the mind, but in the nerves. And so, for slaves, truth was not told, it was suffered. The Roman legal system treated slaves as property, not people. It was not considered cruelty. This practice had a name: quaestio per tormenta, questioning through torture. It could take place in private homes, in court, or in public venues. Imagine now a household in Rome. Their silence would not be believed. This was the inversion at the heart of the system. The idea that suffering purified speech. A confession given without torture was seen as tainted. It was not only in political trials. In some cases, entire households were subjected to this process. And then there were the loyal ones. But these were rare cases. The master might be condemned. There were no appeals. For the slaves, this was more than legal risk. Some masters tried to shield their slaves. Others sacrificed them readily. There were legal provisions, but they were thin. Even in death, the echoes remained. And yet, the practice endured. The Roman legal mind was brilliant, but it was not merciful. It sought order, not fairness. It believed in structure, not compassion. And so the slave waited. Social engineering through punishment. When we picture Roman colonies, colonia, we often imagine distant outposts of civilization, planted like flags in foreign soil, spreading Roman language, customs, and architecture across the vastness of the empire. But beneath the tiled roofs and orderly streets, it restructured, it repopulated, it reorganized the human landscape, sometimes gently, sometimes with a firm hand to secure its influence. And one of its most effective methods was to send people away. After land reforms or confiscations, after failed uprisings or shifts in allegiance, entire groups might be relocated. Not forcibly, perhaps, but with little real choice. They were offered land in a new colonia, a promise of security and prosperity, framed as an opportunity. But it was also a dispersal, a way of softening dissent by scattering the dissenters. Not just into exile, not as punishment alone, streets arranged in Roman grid patterns. It was the shape of the street, the calendar of festivals, the language of contracts. A rebellious town might be subdued not by destruction, but by transformation. New settlers brought in, old buildings repurposed. A new inscription on the gate, subtle, less about punishment of individuals than of communities. Through the movement of people like chess pieces on a vast imperial board. Some moved with gratitude, others with reluctance, but all moved under the same shadow, the will of the state, directing the flow of bodies across the empire. Less about the sword and more about the map, the past covered in fresh plaster, and the subtle realization that your life had been redirected, not ended, not broken, but moved, slightly off course, quietly watched. Colonia Claudia era Agrippinensium, now Cologne. Colonia Julia Augusta Felix Baratus, modern Beirut. Every stone laid, every street marked, every altar raised in honor of the emperor. All of it part of a quiet choreography that kept the borders of the empire firm, not with war, but with presence. The names tethered the cities to emperors, to dynasties, to the central machinery of power. They were not just settlements. They were reminders. Roman identity was not imposed at sword point, but absorbed through routine. And that was precisely the point. Cultural fractures formed. Not all colonists were equal. Veterans held status. Original Roman citizens retained privileges. Locals, even if granted citizenship, often found themselves at the edge of power, their voices quieter in the councils, their influence muted beneath the weight of imported tradition. And when local uprisings occurred, it was often the colonia that stood as flashpoints, reminders of Roman order planted in lands that had not asked for it. Local duumviri, or co-magistrates, governed the towns under the eye of imperial administrators. Law codes were enforced, taxes collected, loyalty expected. Dissent, when it arose, was noted and managed. Temples and baths to reflect the mother city. Latin inscriptions, Latin rituals, Latin laws. In Gaul, in North Africa, in Britannia, even in the shadow of old Carthage, Rome planted its replicas, not as imitations, but as assertions. You live here now, and here is how you will live. But as population management with political intent, beneath the colonnaded forums and carefully laid roads to reward the loyal. After years of service, they were granted plots, a reward certainly, but also a tactic. These men, trained in discipline and loyalty, were placed in volatile provinces, their presence both stabilizing and intimidating. The Roman government knew that a small group of retired soldiers, armed with land and pride, could anchor a region more effectively than an entire legion, to separate the dangerous from the powerful. At times, they were buffers against rebellion. At others, pressure valves for overcrowded cities. They were instruments of settlement, but also of social engineering, reassigning bodies to new places to achieve strategic calm. These settlements served another, quieter purpose. They were not only centers of expansion, they were tools of control. Rome did not simply conquer through force. The colonia were used to absorb the restless. Veterans were among the most common recipients of colonial land. But the colonies were also destinations for those removed from the urban elite, not as reward, but as soft punishment. Political agitators who had drawn too much attention, men who had fallen out of favor, but not so far as to be executed, were sometimes resettled. A change of scenery, a redirection of energy. No chains, no exile decree, just a quiet reassignment to a distant district, where their influence would diminish under provincial sun. And then there were the dispossessed. The layout of these colonies was deliberate. For those born into these colonies, Rome was not a distant power, but the colonies also carried layers of tension. In some regions, the colonists were seen as intruders, especially where local customs remained strong. Conflict simmered between native populations and Roman settlers. Within the colonies themselves, distinctions remained. The legal structures of the colonies mirrored those of Rome, but with adaptations. Occasionally, entire cities were refounded as colonies, their old names modified or erased. In this way, punishment and politics converged. This strategy was long-term. Even the names of the colonies told a story. And so Rome spread, not only through conquest, but through placement. To live in a colonia was to exist in a space shaped by purpose, perhaps your own, but more often Rome's. And so punishment did not always come with chains or exile. Sometimes it came with a piece of land, a house in a distant place. In the grand histories of Rome, The victories, the emperors, the aqueducts and marble columns, the punishments are often quiet. They appear only in the margins. The expectation that law is a structure of hierarchy. And though modern societies claim to preserve history more transparently, the temptation to erase remains. Names disappear from records. And in doing so, it blurred the line between punishment and ritual. The state did not simply act, it performed. And in that performance, it reinforced the idea that every citizen was watched, measured, and, when necessary, corrected. That order is a virtue above all. That some lives are easier to remove than others. Statues are removed or renamed. The words we use, decimate, penal, colony, discipline, all carry Roman roots. We study them not just to understand Roman society, but to recognize what happens when systems grow more invested in structure than in humanity. The philosophy of Seneca, shaped under the shadow of imperial threat, still speaks to us of endurance, of moral clarity. The stories of erased names, Gita, Domitian, countless others, survive not because the empire wished them to, but because people remembered. That a name removed, a man silenced, a people relocated. These things can be done without spectacle, and still reshape the world. New ways of organizing power, but the echoes of its punishments remain. But because they were the most enduring. In policy, in memory, in culture, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, always present, because silence, when recorded, becomes a kind of sound in the architecture of courtrooms, in the language of law, in the spaces between what is said and what is not said. They began as terms of the state, terms of control, and though they now appear softened by centuries, their core meanings endure. One born not from the state, but from those it punished. Texts are edited, revised, forgotten, not by imperial decree, but by consensus, by discomfort, by design. The ghost of Roman forgetting remains with us, not always visible, but always nearby. That suffering can be assigned with precision. That silence itself can be a sentence. These ideas, codified so long ago, did not vanish when Rome fell. They lingered, they transformed, they were inherited. A name missing from a list, a tomb with no epitaph, set a model for structured inequality that many later civilizations adopted, whether consciously or not. It taught that the law can be detailed, even elegant, while still permitting cruelty. That order can be prized over fairness. That punishment, when organized enough, appears reasonable. A law cited in passing. And yet, across centuries, these silences reveal more than they hide. For Rome did not only shape the world with its armies and architecture, but with its ways of forgetting, of correcting, of reshaping lives to fit its preferred order. The legacy of Roman punishment is not just written in the annals of brutality or legal codes, but in what it made ordinary. The practice of Damnatio Memoriae, for instance, the erasure of individuals from public life, was not unique to Rome, but Rome refined it into policy. The Roman legal system, with its stark divisions between citizen and slave, between patrician and plebeian, even the methods of Roman justice, exile, public humiliation, forced suicide, have echoes in later systems. The Soviet use of internal exile, the Chinese practice of public shaming, the Western traditions of solitary confinement and social ostracization. The tools change, the forms shift, but the idea of punishing not only the body, but the identity, of removing someone not just from the space, but from the conversation, remains. Rome's obsession with control extended to death itself. It turned execution into theater, suicide into decorum, exile into silence. This legacy left its imprint not only on law, but on literature, philosophy, and language. In modern governance, in justice systems, in public discourse, the Roman model still whispers. The idea that suffering must be efficient, But there is another legacy, too. The poems of Ovid, written in the cold wind of Taunus, taught future generations that even in exile, the voice remains. Even the laws, preserved through scribes and scholars, serve today not only as models, but as warnings. In this way, the legacy of Roman punishment is not fixed. It is a thread woven into later ages, into new empires, new governments. It lives in the decisions of administrators. And perhaps most hauntingly, it lives in our acceptance, our understanding that punishment need not be loud to be lasting. What the silence left behind was not emptiness. It was framework, a system, a model, a rhythm. Rome has long since fallen. Its stones are scattered, its legions gone, not because they were the most brutal. You're still here, quietly, perhaps with eyes closed, perhaps half asleep. The weight of the world has grown lighter around you, and the voices of ancient Rome have softened into a distant hum. The names, the laws, the stone streets and formal decrees, they linger like the echo of footsteps long faded. We have drifted together through a history not of battles or triumphs, but of punishments, deliberate, precise, and often forgotten. You've walked with emperors who vanished without graves, seen the smooth-faced statues where once stern brows stood. You've stood at the edges of exile, where silence speaks louder than judgment. You've watched soldiers punished by shame, not wounds. You've seen the law wielded like a chisel, carving people not into memory, but out of it. And through it all, the rhythm of control, subtle, systemic, and deeply Roman, has followed each step. Yet here you are, breathing softly in a different world. No laws hang over you, no decree to be feared, against chaos, against noise, against the rush of days that demand so much. You've chosen to be still, to listen, to wander gently through the ruins without hurry, without judgment. No messenger at your door. Its marble has cooled. A name may resurface. 2. As the past grows distant, as your breath grows slower, as the world around you narrows into something quiet and kind, a law may be remembered. But for tonight, let them rest. The stories for now return to sleep. The silence of now is not the silence of punishment, but of comfort. A room gently dimmed, a space that is entirely yours. The air is still, and no name need be forgotten. No face erased. No words forced through pain. This moment, as quiet as it is its own kind of resistance. And so we leave Rome behind, not in disgrace, nor in exile, but simply in peace. Its shadows have grown soft. Tomorrow, they may rise again. And let yourself drift. Thank you for spending this time in stillness, wherever you are. May your rest be easy and your dreams gentle. Good night.